This is a panel on, as the title suggests, creating the core of the next edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, and there. Thank you. Thank you.
Lead by example.
Yes. We will be focusing on creation of the core rules, core classes, core races, etc. All the things that make up the heart of Dungeons and Dragons. With me on the panel today, well, first I'll introduce myself. I'm Jeremy Crawford. I oversee development and editing for Dungeons and Dragons. On my right is Mike Merles. Mike, tell them what you do.
I am the senior manager for the R&D team. I basically oversee everything about D&D, the role-playing game, digital games, board games. Yeah, so basically the whole kit and caboodle.
He's our boss.
Kind of, I guess. Yeah,
and on my left is Rodney Thompson. Rodney, what do you do?
I am the lead final designer of D&D Next. I also work on the board games. I designed Lords of Waterdeep and Dungeon Command, and I've been an RPG designer for 11 years now.
Yeah.
Wow.
Including work on Star Wars Saga.
Yep.
Which
I was the lead designer of the Star Wars Saga Edition product line.
All right, so Mike, why don't you launch things for us, talking about the general vision for creating D&D Next?
Yeah, so first to start with, actually, just out of curiosity, who here has downloaded the playtest materials? Just go ahead and raise your hands. Okay, so most people are. Okay, cool.
And follow-up question, how many of you have downloaded the playtest materials that were released this week?
Okay.
Hey, there we go.
Almost the same number.
Okay. So basically, if you looked at the playtest, this is probably something you've noticed, and if you haven't yet, this is kind of our goal with the design is to really get D&D back to its roots, but at the same time acknowledging D&D has a long history. So we really want to take D&D, boil it down to the essence of what the game is, and then look at the entire sweep of D&D's history and make sure that regardless of when you started playing or what setting you played in or how you like to play, that D&D is offering support for what you like about it. It's really about, rather than picking a play style or a type of campaign and saying, this is Dungeons & Dragons, it's really about saying, no, Dungeons & Dragons, at the end of the day, it's what the players and DM make of it.
Yeah, because one of the things that we come back to very often is that D&D has had such longevity because it appeals to so many different styles of play and so many different kinds of game groups. There are groups who love D&D who are largely, improv actors, and they spend their sessions telling intricate stories and role-playing the heck out of their characters. On the other extreme, there are groups for whom D&D is largely a tactical miniatures game, and they are busting orcs' skulls and slaying dragons and taking their loot. And probably the bulk of D&D groups are, somewhere in the middle of that continuum. And what we are striving for is to embrace that entire spectrum of D&D experiences, because they have always, since first edition, been a part of what makes D&D D&D.
Yeah, because D&D is really, it's a game, but it's something that really draws on the creativity of the people taking part in it. You could memorize all the rules to D&D, but still not really get what makes D&D interesting and what makes it compelling. You could follow all the rules and still not actually be playing the game. So that's kind of the thing, acknowledging that why the rules are part of the game, they aren't the game. They are just a tool people use to role play. I mean, that's the essence of it.
The game that is D&D is the game that happens at your table.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've taken a real approach of trying to boil everything down to a very, say, small but fierce, kind of Cold Quarterly-esque, a core of rules that are fairly flexible and easy to use, and then creating a series of rules modules, rules expansions that you can add on to tailor the game to your taste and to the taste of your group. So you could imagine that if you've seen the playtest rules, the core combat rules don't assume that you use miniatures, but we can just go ahead and make a set of optional rules. Hey, if you're using miniatures and using a grid, or if you're using hexes, or if you want to use a tape measure in inches, here's how to convert our measures. Here's how to make that work. Because again, it's just about how do you want to play D&D. There's no reason for us to pick the right way to play D&D, because that again just kind of runs counter to what D&D is. Anything I'm missing as far as the overview, or is there anything you want to chime in on?
Another big piece of this sort of big tent approach to D&D, of making room for all the fans of D&D through the decades, is for us to look at all of the editions of the game and examine what is really shown in each edition. What has been particularly great about first edition, what sparkled in second, what was fabulous in third, and what did people really groove on in fourth, and make sure that our work reflects all of those best elements. Not necessarily as a literal translation, because you all know that if we literally took the rules from first and the rules from second and the rules from third and the rules from fourth and just simply stitch them together, we'd have the Frankenstein's monster of a game. So it's much more about capturing the spirit of those wonderful elements and synthesizing them in a way where they live naturally together in a modern expression of Dungeons and Dragons in its great diversity.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you'll see as we go on through the playtest is that more and more of those things will sort of get added in. Like, imagine that this game is actually a big stew pot, and we're slowly adding these ingredients in. And you'll start recognizing more and more of the ingredients from various places over the years as they come in. So it's a gradual process as well. And there's a lot of things that are sort of subtle and behind the scenes that are underlying that we've taken from one edition to another. So there's a nice mix of sort of very overt things that you can see immediately. Oh, this is just like it was in X edition, plus a mix of sort of philosophies and ideas that we've taken from those editions and added them in as well.
Anything you want to say about the 4 classic classes? The wizard, the cleric, the rogue, the fighter.
What isn't there to say about it? So basically, we've been focusing on the classic 4, the 4 core, sort of the first 4 classes, the first 3, then the thief came along later. So really for us, the way we kind of see it is those are the classes that almost everyone who's played D&D has been exposed to in some form. Again, unless you've only played OD&D and never bought into the expansions and never even looked at them since 1974, those are 4 character classes that have been in the game. So we've been spending a lot of time on refining those. We had our first version that came out in May. If you've looked at the new playtest packet, you've seen that in response to a lot of the feedback we've gotten from playtest surveys, from just reading comments online, blogs, forum posts, all that stuff, we've made some changes. It's going to be a very iterative process as we go forward, because in some way, it's really about us uncovering the core identity of what makes D&D D&D. Creating a fighter that everyone go, hey, that is a D&D fighter. That looks like a D&D fighter. It acts like it, and it plays like it. It doesn't feel like it's out of place. You could almost imagine, in almost any edition, if you played this fighter, it would feel like, yeah, that it could fit in. You might want to take certain options to make that work, but those options are there. It's not impossible. So, and hopefully it's easy. The races too. The races are kind of interesting because we talk a lot about classes. We've done a lot of work in the classes. The races have been a little bit smoother. Can you guys think of any changes we made to the races as we've gone on? What's either of you want to talk about races and our philosophy toward them, or?
They've evolved a little bit. Those of you that see in the packet, you'll notice that we have, for many of the races, we have sub-races, our thing we're doing right out of the gate. And that was something that we iterated on before we really put out the first packet. But since the first packet, most people didn't really get a chance to interact with the basic race stuff. Now with this new packet that we've put out this week, I think we'll start seeing a little bit more feedback on that too. To sort of touch on something that Mike said, this idea of the iterative process is something that we developed first on the board game line, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a panel later today, shameless plug for later today, but this iterative process is something we really want to bring to the game, and the idea is that what we're doing until it hits print, it's never done, right? We want to keep refining and get more feedback and refine. So you'll see things that are in this playtest packet right now, those things will change over the course of weeks and months and what have you as more playtesting gets done. So anytime we put out new material, it's being done with the assumption that we're going to be gathering feedback and changing it. And I think that that's one of the sort of big things that's going to separate the process for designing and developing D&D Next from previous editions, is that we want to make sure that everything we do meets our goals and is meeting those goals in practical play. And the only way we can do that is to put things out there, have you guys actually play them, give us feedback, refine, repeat, right? And I think that's I can't overstate the importance of the playtesting and the feedback, because that's the only way we can actually do refinement on what's being put out there.
Yeah, and this refinement process, you're able to witness it yourselves through the public playtest packets simply by looking at a class like the fighter.
Right.
The fighter, just as sort of as a design puzzle, is a great example of us looking at all of the additions and attempting to create a version of something in the game, in this case the fighter, that will appeal to lovers of fighters from every edition. Now, all of you who are familiar with the evolution of the fighter over the years know that this is actually kind of a tricky puzzle, because the fighter very early in D&D's history is extremely simple. And, oh, I'm being told to speak louder. Okay, good to know, thank you. The fighter in earlier editions, as I was mentioning, super simple. It was the go-to class for a person who wanted to just pick up a sword, dash into battle, and hew off some goblin heads. But over time, the class has taken on more and more tactical options, sort of fully flowering into the broad array of tactical options that we have in the 4th edition version of the fighter. And so the design puzzle for us now is to create a fighter that can morph into either of those things. A fighter that can, if a person wants it, be extremely straightforward and easy to play, or it's essentially the pick up and play class, but also a fighter that can be adjusted for the person who desires more tactical choice to become that more tactically oriented class. And so you're going to see a lot of fine-tuning,
right,
different pieces in the fighter. And again, I could say this about any class.
Sure.
But the fighter is a great example of something will be introduced, something will be toned down, something will be cranked up, as we try to get just the right balance. With races, going back to the race question, right. Sorry,
Secret
Mike,
messages,
yeah,
watch out.
Mike is passing me notes.
Just gonna speak through the mic.
Do you like me? Check yes or no.
No, it's just
Maybe.
funny because I could notice when Jeremy was talking, he kept kind of turning and looking at me like this, and you can't.
Oh,
hear me
right,
well.
right.
So when we do the podcast, they always tell us speak through the microphone.
Right.
And I noticed your mic was kind of low, and you
Yeah.
were turning to the side.
And I'm tall.
Yeah, you're a big guy, so tall guy.
So with races, as Rodney mentioned, you're really seeing the races in their full form for the first time this week. And this sub-race approach is, again, a part of our big tent approach to the game. Because sub-races in the history of the game have always been around in some form or another. Even if they haven't always been in the core version of the game, say in the player's handbook, they've always ended up appearing in our campaign settings. You know, they're in Forgotten Realms, they're in Dragonlance, they're in Greyhawk. And so what we're doing right now with the races is seeing about incorporating that sub-race concept into the core game itself. So that, again, people who come with all sorts of different expectations for the game can create the kind of elf they want to create, can create the kind of halfling they want to create. And so we're looking forward to seeing what you think of this approach. And as with the classes, in the future packets, you are likely to see iteration. Little things are going to evolve in the races that are currently before you.
Yeah, I think both the fighter and the sub-races point out an aspect of the design that's sort of following our goals, and that is that what we really are aiming at is making sure that these two different kinds of fighters or these two different kinds of elves can be built using the stuff that's already in there, right? I mean, we want that complex fighter and that simple fighter to just be different options that are sitting in the fighter, as opposed to like requiring alternate rules or twistings of, you know, basic assumptions and things like that. Now, there will always be, you know, campaign-specific things. I don't have a sun god in my campaign, so there can't be a sun domain cleric. Well, that's fine, right? That's up to the DM with his campaign. But really, when we talk about like a variety of complexity or variety of options or different ways of building these characters, in many ways, we're talking about options within the base game itself that we want people to pick and choose from to build that kind of character that they want.
I'm glad you mentioned domain, because the cleric is another exciting design challenge, because the cleric, like the fighter, has gone through massive evolution over the course of the game. In terms of sort of mechanical detail and story elements that have clustered around the class, in some ways it's gone through the most evolution. And I say this largely because of specialty priests in 2nd edition. In 2nd edition, the cleric was the one of the 4 core classes that could essentially morph into anything because of the specialty priest system. And for those of you who also played 2nd edition, you know that this was really kind of awesome if you played a cleric, or if you were a DM and wanted to use the cleric class as a way to express different elements of the religions in your home setting. You could do anything with the cleric. You could have, basically the cleric of every god behaving like its own class. In 1st edition, though, largely the cleric was sort of the Templar figure, wearing heavy armor and smiting evil and healing his or her allies. And then we've seen sort of a mix of those 2 different approaches in 3rd edition and 4th edition. Also, the cleric has been the home for players who sometimes want a dash of healing ability, but otherwise want to spend a lot of their time bashing things over the head with their mace or calling down divine retribution on their foes with spells like Flame Strike or, from 4th edition, Lance of Faith, that sort of thing. On the other end of the extreme, the class has always attracted a segment of the audience who loves playing the dedicated healer. They feel fulfilled and feel like they're playing exactly the character they want to play if they spend their turn aiding their friends and knitting together their wounds and also blessing their allies and making them stronger. And so one of the challenges in the cleric is, again, providing options for a variety of cleric players. There are going to be the cleric players who want to smite evil and heal a little bit on the side, but other people who essentially they want to be Florence Nightingale and they want to help their friends. And I bring that up because in a lot of discussion about the game, the cleric is a great example of a character class where discussion often clusters on it, and people will make claims like clerics should just be healing, or clerics should all be able to bash somebody over the head and heal at the same time. And the direction that we have to take is it's far more nuanced than that, because it turns out that there are people who love clerics who actually want different things from the class. And so a part of our approach with these many options that we provide is make it so that you can play the cleric you want to play. And that philosophy extends to all of the classes.
Yeah, it's a little further down the road than where we are right now, but eventually, too, we're going to want to talk about things like we've provided these options for you, and I think we're heading in a direction where we want to also have the DM providing new options for his players and make really DMs and players making the game their own. I mean, it's like I say, it's a little bit further down the road than where we are now, but we probably want to head in a direction where you can make the domains that you want for your campaign, or, I mean, just as an example, right? Because we know that even though we can hit these sort of big archetypes that have come through the editions, every DM's campaign, every player has different needs, right? So there might be subtle distinctions that we don't quite hitting the big archetypes that we want to facilitate with our general approach to letting the DM really, and the players, really get their hands dirty on making the game their own.
Now, a key piece of realizing this approach of having many options for players and many options for DMs is having a core system that is solid, clear, and can transfer from group to group regardless of the options that they layer on top of it. Because I know people have wondered, well, aren't all of these options going to potentially lead to essentially a bunch of different role-playing games? And that's why it's so crucial for us to have a heavily play-tested core system, because that's the through line that we expect to see in every group. That no matter what options you layer on top, no matter what sorts of clerics you have in your world, no matter what cosmology you as a DM decide to use, no matter what subset of monsters you decide to use, or which magic item option that we have provided you decide to use, or the one you decide to create for yourself, underneath all of that, is this core system that will be common from table to table. But also for that to work, the core system needs to be light, because the heavier the core system gets, the harder it is actually to layer meaningful options on top of it. Because then, basically, the heavier a core set of rules gets, the more tendrils it starts wanting to have, like Cthulhu underneath everything else. And suddenly there are these rules hooks in everything, and it becomes harder and harder to have these options that we want you to be able to basically slot in and out without having to worry about, oh, I suddenly took the whole game down because I slotted in one of these options.
Yeah, I like to think of the core rules of the game as sort of a translator. There's certain inputs and then certain outputs, and then all of our classes and races and optional rules and everything speak to those inputs and outputs. But at the center, those core rules are the same, and it's all the stuff sort of on the outside that changes. But that way, what we can do is we can sort of predict, no matter what options you're using, no matter what optional rules you're using, those all go through the same translator and have the same kind of outputs on the other side.
One of the examples of a piece of the game that you can cleanly slot in or drop out of your game and have no negative consequences, again, this depends on the style of game you want, is the feat system, which in the first packet was called the theme system and is currently called the specialty system. Maybe next time we'll call it the popcorn system. But really, it is the delivery device for feats, but packaging feats in a flavorful way. Like rather than picking feats piecemeal, you decide, I'm a magic user, and you get a set of feats related to that specialty. Or my specialty is I'm an archer, and then you get a sequence of feats related to that. We have designed that piece of the game so that if you want, say, a more first edition style experience, you can simply not use it. And you will have still what you need in your race and in your class to have a complete D&D experience. It will certainly be a different experience
right.
from the one that includes feats, because feats add additional abilities, further options, both in combat and out. So again, the experience will be different, but both experiences, perfectly valid forms of Dungeons & Dragons.
I think we cover the basics. Do we want to go to Q&A, or is there anything else you guys want to cover before?
The last thing I would say before we open up the floor to questions is just, again, how valuable your playtest feedback has been already and how valuable it will be in the months ahead. You can already see, as we've said, the effect of your input, and you will continue to see that. And so it's really just please play a ton of Dungeons & Dragons and tell us what you think.
Play our game.
Yeah.
I actually want to jump on top of that and say one of the most important things you guys can do is fill out the surveys that we do with each packet, and we'll do multiple surveys with each one, because those surveys are extremely valuable to us in learning how you guys are using our stuff and what's working and what isn't. So when you guys see those surveys go up or get the email about the survey, please, please, please participate in them, because they are probably one of the best methods we have of getting information directly from you guys that we can use.
Yeah. So we have 2 microphones set up, and please go ahead and queue up.
Yeah, let's just use the
front one.
The mic closest to us. We're not trying to manage 2 queues, and just go ahead. Trevor, do you want to kind of manage the line? Did you mind doing that, or kind of Dragoon Trevor? Could you give me a Coke while you're up?
And just
I'll have a latte, Trevor.
And just in case I need to head these sorts of questions off at the pass, we will not be answering questions about product.
Yeah.
So if your question is, when is the game coming out, or what are the products going to look like, we aren't talking about that yet.
Yeah.
But we are happy to answer questions about the playtest form of the game.
There's also one thing I want to throw out there. So as an FYI, at the top of the hour, I have to head over to where we're having the keynote tonight. The keynote is at 7 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Good job.
And we're going to be covering a lot of the stuff there. It should be pretty exciting. It's over at the Rooftop Ballroom. It's at the theater. It's across the street from the Hyatt. It's on the opposite side of the Hyatt from the convention center. So, all right, questions?
Also, one other bit of scheduling. We will be having another D&D Next panel tomorrow morning that focuses on the DM side of things. And we will be repeating this panel on Saturday.
Yeah. So we'll be here all weekend.
Cool.
Yeah.
I guys try to, sometimes we have like 18 questions apiece. Try to limit to one question. Then you get back in line.
Yeah, and then if there's
Loop
room,
around.
please do get back in line.
Well, so you got entire script here.
Is that an essay? Good
Yeah.
grief. Dear sir.
I'd like to talk to you about
Yeah.
Scientology.
I was just wondering, what's something that you think has changed most dramatically because of feedback?
The fighter.
The fighter.
Yeah, fighter.
Oh yeah. So we have an entire new subsystem of the fighter. It's because some people like having a fighter who just swings every round, and I know the exact percentage of people who say no.
Yes.
I want to be able to choose something different every round.
Yes.
So.
And Mike's reference to the exact percentage, that might sound maybe not worthy of note, but this will be the version of the game backed up by the most amount of data that it has ever had.
And it isn't just like people are voting for stuff, but it does let us get a sense like this is actually a great example to talk about that. We didn't sort of say, hey, what mechanics should we put in? Vote for who's going to win. It's just more we're getting a general directional sense of, hey, this is kind of what I'm not really happy. I don't feel I can make the character I want to play. Hey, you're kind of taking away my character, things like that. Yeah. So this is really helps us directionally. I don't think we ever want to be in a position where we're like, who likes word 5 of paragraph 2, sentence 8? Okay, now word 3, paragraph 2, sentence, and stuff like that. So, all right, next question.
Sure. When I think about you guys talking about like you're using iterative development, you're getting playtest and feedback. Well, I was thinking about this and it was like you got the first edition, lots of feedback, and then we got the next edition, and so we're kind of going through that process right now. So when the game's finally released, what can we expect that's different from the previous editions that you've released, where you're getting feedback? Oh, now it's 3.5. It's this next one. So what can we expect? Maybe not exactly what the product will look like when it's done, but what can we expect from a support and development once it's officially released? Is that?
So this is, and I'll give the answer, and if it doesn't make sense, you can just, So this is kind of my dream, right? When you have an edition, there's always the errata, and there's like the 0.5, the 0.55, and all this stuff, get all these releases. I would love to do all that stuff before we release the game. So when the game comes out, it's, hey, it works, right? It's not like, and now we have to keep iterating to actually try to get it right. And that's really, again, why we're starting really simple, because one of the things we've learned, like with our board games, Castle Ravenloft, and with Dungeon Command, our new minis game, when you have a game that can play fairly fast, you can play test the heck out of it internally in our department, and more importantly, so then when you guys get to play test it, you don't have to put aside 8 hours to play it. But it also means everything's a lot simpler. It's much easier for us to make changes. We were just I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head of a class that we just made big changes to, and it only took like an hour, right, for us to do the work, and then say 4 2-hour play sessions internally to get it. Okay, this is actually working.
It's one we can't talk about.
Yeah. That's right. Because we have other stuff we're working on. But there is these cases where we can give the characters to people in customer service or in finance who play D&D, and they just read it and play it and go, hey, this works, or this is great. It's like, what did you like about it? Well, the best thing about the fighter was all those spells I could cast. You're like, okay, we probably screwed that up, right? There's something wrong here, But so that's really what the emphasis has been, and hopefully we can kind of put that stuff behind us where we're not, there's the old joke, right? For any software, if you work in software, you kind of think the competitor as, what the customer is our playtester, right? We are literally doing that now, so you're not paying for it later.
Right. And so my question was how do you guys envision or have the vision of once it's released, how are you going to release D&D and manage and support it, and what's different than how it's been released in previous editions?
A lot of that stuff we're going to kind of touch on at the keynote tonight. Okay. We're not going to have specific products really to talk about, but we're going to start giving you the vision of the thing. But really what we want to be able to do is get away from emphasizing just rules and start emphasizing more role-playing and more the overall thing about what makes D&D different, like creating your own campaigns. Like what Rodney was talking about, like with cleric domains, creating your own domains, things like that. And I think a lot of it will be like play style. Like you could almost imagine under this game, if we do it right, it's very modular. If we were to do, say, Castle Ravenloft, the module, that might come with the horror rules module. You know, like, okay, so if you want to run a horror D&D campaign, here's our suggested rules, you know, and it's like, okay, this is like it makes fear more important, adds sanity, or, you know, for this gothic horror sense. Here are the variant undead. Like, you know, every undead creature now has a couple of these traits that make undead really scary, more like in the kind of classic horror movie sense. Or even things like, here's how your hit points work now, so characters get different numbers of hit points, you know, things like that. And I think that's where we can do a lot of interesting design work, because I think everyone knows D&D and the core D&D and like a Greyhawk campaign or a Forgotten Realms campaign. And I think what we can start doing is focusing on pushing the boundaries outward, rather than constantly going, here's another thing your fighter can do, and here's another way that two-weapon fighting can work, and here's a new type of bow that does more damage than the old bow. Like, we can kind of get off that treadmill. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely a lot more focus on sort of practical applications as opposed to theoretical applications.
So there's a documentary, I don't know if you guys have maybe seen it, it's called about product design, it's called Objectified, and it's basically, there's a statement in there which says, you know, don't design for the middle, design for the extremes, the middle will take care of itself. And, you know, you talk about how there's these two extremes, a sort of extremely light, extremely loose type of D&D player, and then the extremely super tactical, super minis focused. Well, we have 4th edition, you have old school clones, retro clones. So, and people certainly seem to have been flocking to that or backing their horse and saying, I'm going to stick with 4th, I played OD&D, 3 brown books. So what is going to make someone who's already in an established Pathfinder game or 4th edition game or OD&D game say, I'm going to switch to next?
Yeah, I think it goes along what you just talked about,
Right.
where we really are designing to those extremes. You know, we're going to build the really slimmed down, you know, version of the game where it is just the bare minimum, and then we're also going to circle around and give you everything, right? It's like, you know, the old country buffet, like it's here. You know, if a human can eat it, we have it, right? And then some, right? If you want to eat the silverware, go for it, right? And then I think that's what's going to make this version of D&D really different, is it truly is that middle. You're going to find your own middle, and you're going to start either from that really bare bones and then go through the entire, you know, you can think that it's the skeleton versus the zombie, right? Like, where do you want to rest within that spectrum? And if you look back on D&D, I don't think D&D's ever done that before. Each edition, knowingly or not, has kind of picked a play style. You know, like with 4th, there was a very conscious decision for the play style. 3rd was very, like, sim based on, we want to give you comprehensive rules. 1st kind of had a play style fall out of it, you know, based on Gary playing the game and everyone else just, you know, playing the game they wanted to. So this is, I think, the first version of D&D that's been consciously built from the beginning to cater to where you want to rest on that continuum, rather than take a game. There'll always be house rules, but rather than trying to figure, well, how does the core work? Really, how can I house rule this? How can I make this my own? And maybe running into problems with it. We're building it almost kind of like a platform, you know, like it's, you know, where we know people are going to modify it. And when I see people like talk about how they're already hacking the game, that makes me super happy, because I want this to be like the most hackable version of D&D ever released. And I think that is our big mechanics. That is our big difference.
And in spirit, I would say it is closest to 1st edition. In detail, it will, you know, you'll look at the 1st edition books and look at these books, and it will be wildly different. But in spirit, in terms of how people experienced the game, it will be most like that. And the reason why I say that is the 1st edition books are extremely detail-rich, and I'm choosing my words diplomatically. I happen to love a lot of that detail, but I know it was off-putting for many people. But back in the day when 1st edition was so popular, part of the reason it was so popular is that many groups who didn't want all that detail and surprise rules that were nearly incomprehensible. And if you have a 1st edition DMG, trust me, take a look at those surprise rules if you want to just shatter your brain for the afternoon. They are fantastic and incomprehensible. But there are people who still loved the game because they would just house rule out all of that material, or sometimes just not even consciously house rule it out. They would just ignore it, and created a much more free-form sort of theater of the mind style of the game. So just naturally 1st edition catered to these two extremes. There were people who followed, you know, speed factor and all of these very precise rules and used minis and, you know, had their measuring tape out and were using hexes. And then you also had people playing 1st edition where they used hardly any rules at all, and it was largely improvisational acting. And so this is just another way of saying that, yeah, absolutely, it's those extremes we care about. Because the game has already gone down the path of picking a point somewhere in the middle and just pegging the game at that point. Yeah. And that leads to fragmentation. And so we're far more interested in, again, embracing the huge richness that is D&D.
Yeah, the funny thing is, it's not really a spectrum in my mind. It's actually a big circle, right? And like, there's like, oh, I really love theater of the mind style play, and I really love, playing with minis. There's also like, oh, I really love, super intense role playing, and I also love, all this exploration. And so there's all these sort of extremes of different spectrums and things. And we want to make sure that we can hit sort of the Venn diagram of all these things overlapping to find your game is somewhere in this circle.
You see like the ideal D&D as being like right in the middle of game myth narrative.
Oh yeah, I think that's the way it's always been. I think that those labels kind of arose from people just sort of trying to, because D&D is if you're like, someone wrote this online, I forget who it was, but like if your theory of RPGs is not broken by D&D, it's not, like, it doesn't work. Like D&D always breaks those theories, because I think it is. I think D&D is the one game that really, well, there are other games that do this, but it really embraces the idea of you're going to make of it what you will. So, okay.
Fourth edition was built, at least it appeared to be built with a kind of emphasis on character balance, like trying to, no matter what somebody throws together to make a character, they're all going to have a good time, they're all going to be fun, despite there's feat obsolescence, and there's like, you just make really horrible choices, but still you're going to make a playable character. Are you using that design principle at all, or are you just kind of throwing it out the window being like, no, it's okay that wizards are weak at first and great at 20th?
It's a little bit of a mix. So one of the things we wanted to make sure was that if you were playing D&D for the first time as a first level character, you came away, let's just say typical DM, just using the core rules. You came away thinking, hey, this is D&D, it's the game where I explore dungeons and go on fantasy adventures. We wanted to make sure the classes weren't so different. Like if you look at the wizard now, he has at-will spells. We're like, oh, I'm a wizard because I want to be a guy who uses magic. Oh, but I'm not. I have one spell. And once I use it, I'm not really a wizard anymore. I'm just a crossbowman or I'm a guy throwing darts or knives. So, even though darts are 3 shots per round in AD&D, they're awesome.
But man, you had to carry so many darts.
And just go get them. Just go get them after you throw them.
So we are kind of bringing the power bands closer together. But what we also want to be able to do is say, hey, if you're playing a wizard and you want to be an illusionist, like you're not doing any damage, you're just kind of tricking people, or you want to be the really deceptive guy who can like charm people and get away with being like the suave kind of manipulative guy, you can do that. The really kind of focus on that. We had this idea of like the 3 pillars of D&D. Interacting with NPCs, exploring weird locations, and fighting monsters. And letting players go, hey, I'm going to make a wizard, and I get to kind of pick my guy's specialty. Like, what do I like about D&D? Where do I want to settle my interests on? Now, some classes like the fighter is just always going to be good at fighting, hence the name. But but even within like our background system, we're like we've removed skill lists from the character classes. Any class can take any skill now. So it's, hey, you can really, do I want to be the fighter who's a real inspiring leader? I can take a high charisma and take those skills. So that's that's part of it. So instead of necessarily scripting out what people can do, we're moving away from that aspect of 4th edition, but we are keeping this idea of, we want players to feel like more, not that, oh, my character is just strictly weaker than yours, but more, oh, my character does different things, because I'm casting spells and you're a warrior or you're a rogue. So,
and in particular areas of the game, like when it comes to damage output, we have the same kind of rigorous mathematical approach that we have applied in 4th edition. But as Mike said, the key is we want to make sure that each class is first and foremost what it needs to be the best expression of itself. We want the wizard to feel totally wizardly. Yeah. We want the fighter to be the most fighty.
Yeah. But we also know that in some ways damage is kind of fake, right? It's kind of our best guess for just, but that's not really like, right, because if you take charm, you can take an illusion spell and do far more damage, right, by breaking the adventure with it than just blowing someone up with a fireball.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. Because the danger of following a notion of balance too dogmatically is that balance very quickly, if you're not careful, morphs not into balance but into symmetry, which isn't actually the same thing. And that kind of balance at its worst makes everything identical. And you'll see this sometimes in games where it's like, well, the name of what my wizard is doing is different from the name of what the fighter is doing, but if I look at the effects, they're exactly the same thing. And we feel that in a class-based game, a class should actually have something that it does that other classes don't do.
Yeah.
Because that is a part of the genius of the class-based design that's been in D&D from the beginning, and that is when you pick a class, in a way you are picking a new game experience. We want it to be so that when you're playing a cleric, you feel like you're playing a slightly different game than when you're playing a rogue.
Oh, you're playing a different role, right?
Yeah.
In an acting sense, right? You are a different person.
Right.
So
Right.
that's
Exactly.
really the root of it.
Yeah, I'd like to say one more thing about the sort of balance idea. In general, we have sort of, imagine we have like a target, right? And we're aiming at that target as sort of the center of what each character class is going to be doing. And that's pretty similar across the classes. But in general, I would say we also can accept a little more variance in either direction as far as, like Mike was saying, like we think it's okay if you want to focus on illusions and maybe your damage is a little bit lower. And like, you know, that's still sort of around our target, but it's not right dead center on our target. But the big thing is we want to make sure you're making a conscious choice to choose those illusion spells or what have you, as opposed to sort of accidentally stumbling into a character that you didn't really want to play or a character that you feel is ineffective. It should be something you're willfully choosing to do.
Yeah. What we absolutely don't want to do is say things like, oh, if you want to be a really good archer, you should play, you know, and then give you horrible advice, like play a cleric who has a sling, right? And that's just like, oh, that's thanks, right? Thanks, book. I didn't need, you know, I now have a terrible character, right? And so, anyways, next question.
So this may be a little bit farther ahead of where you're at in development, but you know, I love the pen and paper role-playing games, but so much lately it's been just as easy and just as interesting with all the tools that D&D Insider had. You know, I love the character builder even before some of the changes that weren't as popular, but with the new edition of D&D being so wide encompassing, and a huge part of it they're trying to bring back, even though we could still do it with 4th edition, is the homebrewing. I mean, you know, all the different changes, everything's like that. It was extremely hard in previous things for the character builder, for example, to do homebrew stuff. You have, you know, groups that, you know, my college group now, we're on all ends of the state or even ends of the country, so we're doing a lot more stuff online via map tool or things along those lines. Even at the tables, you know, I walk through the game things, and everybody has iPads out with the PDFs of the manuals on there, you know, and basically pretty much what they can do, so you don't have to add a bottle of ibuprofen to your dice bag for carrying a backpack full of books. And so I'm curious on where is next going to go, since so much home brewing, so much user input and changes on those kind of tools for online, and just the availability to, again, play the game how you want to play it.
Yeah, so we definitely want to have tools available. We don't really have details now to talk about, but this does go back to the overall philosophy, since we are building from the start, assuming we have a simple core that you can kind of scale up what rules you want to use. That naturally dovetails nicely into house ruling. Because essentially, if you decide, hey, I want to use the miniatures rules, that's kind of like a house rule. It's just a house rule we've given to you. So we already have that infrastructure in place from the start when we're planning out things that can account for that kind of thing. Now, I don't have any details on like how we might exactly implement that, but we know that that's what we want to be possible in D&D and on all aspects of the role-playing game. So regardless of how you're interacting with it, you have a sense, hey, the DM's kind of is setting the table rules for this campaign. It's kind of like if you're playing poker at someone's house. Hey, this is how we're going to play. And we wouldn't want something that we see, hey, this is really important to the RPG, and we think it's a really cool thing people would like. Oh, and it actually doesn't do what people want to do with the game. I think that's just that just makes people unhappy. So does that kind of answer what you?
Yeah, it was just kind of curious, because that's one of the biggest problems with, and especially, you know, I enjoyed the D&D Insider tools, but they were horrible if you want to try to homebrew something.
Yeah, exactly.
Your own thing. And now I was kind of curious on how you're trying to fix that for 5th edition.
So yeah, so we don't have any technical specific things, but again, since we know we're building the system that way, we kind of already have to solve for that anyway. So. And
again, even something I can add, because it's not specifically about digital products that we can't yet talk about. One of the reasons why you see that in the tools we have now is the tools are built to support a different philosophy. 4th has a very conscious philosophy that everything published for the game is core. And that has a lot of ramifications. So, you know, if something is published for the game, it is considered to be an official part of the game. That is not going to be an assumption of ours for the next edition.
Well, I think it's we have the opposite assumption. Like the Ravenloft example, we don't assume everyone's using the horror rules. So,
Right.
And so that change of assumption alone will naturally lead to very different tools.
All previous versions of D&D have run pretty well at low levels, including Next, including Fourth, and all throughout. And I'd say all of them break down when you start to get to high levels. What do you plan to do to ensure that high-level play runs well in Next?
So first thing is we're going to play test the heck out of it. So I mean, that's
Right.
And but
We haven't seen any yet.
Yeah, we haven't seen it, so it's definitely something we've been. I don't know, maybe one of you guys wants to talk a little bit about this, but that's I think the first step is going to be, because I remember when I play tested 3.0. It was like, oh great, and I think the way we play test is we're like how other people play tested. Hey, let's make up some first level characters. Great, let's start playing, kind of like it's campaign. And then around third level, you either like, oh, we missed a few sessions, or hey, the game's coming out next month, so why are we playtesting? Oh, whatever. Like you just didn't have time.
Right.
So it's one of the nice things about having this kind of directed playtest. And in some ways, you guys it's been great that you sort of were able to bear with us. Like the first packet we just had pre-gens, you couldn't make characters, and now you can make characters. That's very conscious. That's a very conscious decision on our part. Now, you can rest assured that when we do start showing you stuff above 10th level, it's going to start with pre-gens. It's going to start with an adventure because we're going to want to make sure, hey, this is kind of where we're going to start, and then we'll grow out from there because we really want to kick the tires in the system and not let half the game go untouched.
Yeah,
So-
this is a very methodical process. So in a way, you can kind of extrapolate where this is going time-wise, given what you've seen so far.
Right. To answer the question about high level specifically, one of the things that I think we've already laid the groundwork for a better high level experience is in our what we've called our bounded accuracy system, right? We've changed the way that some of our numbers scale up and focus more on sort of damage and hit points as our primary scaling mechanism. That alone puts a lot of tools in the DM's toolbox that he didn't necessarily have before, because as the players gain levels, the DM just has a larger and larger pool of resources to draw on for designing adventures, right? You can still use orcs at 12th level because you know that those orcs, insufficient numbers, can be a decent threat to your players and everything, right? So that's one element that we've already laid the groundwork for. And then as we go on, we're looking at high-level play as a big problem to be solved. And so, I mean, it's one of those things that every edition has had its ups and downs with. And so I think that we want to make sure that high-level play is one of those areas that I would call a tricky problem, just like the fighter was, that Jeremy said. We want to spend a lot of time focusing on and a lot of effort to fix.
Because quite frankly, it is a piece of the game that has never, in the core of the game, received its own design attention. Now, to be clear, lots of design has been lavished on high-level D&D play. There are high-level spells, high-level monsters, classes that go up to 20, and then in 4th up to 30. But the reason why I say there's never been in the core of the game design attention lavished on high-level play sort of as a subsystem. And for the first time, we're doing that. We are questioning all of the assumptions about high-level play. Because really, in the past, all high-level play is levels 1 through 10 cranked up. And that is a core assumption that we have shown the Eye of Sauron on. and that means that what you end up seeing is likely to be fairly dramatic. Because one of the things we take very seriously is that thing that has been true in every edition of the game is that for the majority of groups, the core D&D experience is levels 1 through 10. And groups that play above level 10 are the outlier. And there are many groups that do it and they love it, but that's always been a different kind of experience for very particular groups. And so we want to take it seriously that it is a different kind of experience.
Yeah, I think we really want to embrace that.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, it's easy to forget that high-level play has also been a piece of the game that has always been in kind of crazy flux. Because in first edition, certain classes went no higher than level 13. I think many of us assume sort of this received wisdom, the game's always had 20 levels. No, actually, there were classes, they hit 13 and they were done. Yeah. And And then over time, 20 sort of became the cap, and then in fourth, 30 became the cap. Although in third there was then the epic level handbook where you could go to infinity. So it's a piece of the game that has always had a softness to it, to the design, and that is something we are hitting head on.
Oh, next question.
You guys say you're going to focus in a lot on choices for the players and all that. Now I'm a GM and I've run at RPGA and all that several times. Every GM I've ever encountered ran into the same problem. Half of them would have to look at the card the player handed them because it's a card game now in 4th edition, And we are totally lost half the time. You have to get a degree in order to know all of those little cards.
Mm-hmm.
How are they going to fix that? Because that's tough.
So one of the first things, as far as when we think about the DM's role, and what I imagine we'll have at some point in the sort of how to start your campaign would be like, well, what classes are you going to allow? Really thinking of it as the DM is making a campaign, it's similar to the way a player might make a character. Like you're going to think, hey, how do I want this campaign to work? What's important in my world? What classes exist? What races are available? Specifically for organized play, what we'll probably do is when we look at all the rules, and again, this hasn't been decided, but we sort of say, kind of like if you think of like any game that has a competitive tournament scene like Warhammer or Magic, they kind of have like their table rules, like, hey, here's what's legal to play here. We'll probably look at doing something like that, where like just to keep so DMs don't go crazy, they're sort of like, hey, here is the list of spells you can choose. Like you can make a character, you can choose whatever you want, but if you want to play an OP in the official OP system, here are the spells, here are the abilities. And
wouldn't that actually make it worse? Because then I definitely have to read all those little cards to decide which ones I want to allow. Right?
Well, this is one of the things we want also on top of that is most of the character classes now, like spellcasters will still have fairly discrete, like, hey, I'm a wizard, I have this thing. If you look at what we've done so far with things like the rogue and the fighter, you're kind of seeing a lot of options there, but I don't really foresee those options growing much beyond things that are like 2-weapon fighting, archery, shield mastery. Like we don't want to get back into the mode of like, oh, my fighter's really good with like the tonfa, and I have like the 3 banana school of fighting. Like you don't even know idea what the hell that is, right? And so you're kind of stuck as a DM trying to guess what does this actually mean. Right. We really want to kind of keep it focused on things that are iconic, that if we invent here's how you get better at archery, we don't want to then make 3 other ways you can get better at archery. We just want to say, look, here's archery, here's what an archer does, and that's done. Getting off that treadmill of having to constantly put out more feats and powers and special abilities and focus instead more on campaigns. If you're changing your characters because, well, I'm playing Dark Sun, and in Dark Sun, here are the special options I can choose, or here's the different way that armor works, things like that.
Where you, like in Dark Sun, you probably would see some new feats and spells and whatnot, but that's because they would be filling a narrative niche that the existing feats and spells were not filling. What Mike is getting at is what we don't want to see is, well, here's basically the same thing but with a different name. No, if we want a spellcaster to cast Fireball or something like it, we'll give them Fireball and we're done. And this is one of the reasons you are seeing the return of a common spell list. This is something we moved away from in 4th edition and that we're returning to. There is a genius in the common spell list, going back to the earliest editions of the game, in that they create not only pieces that a DM can use to build a world, because you have this common lexicon. This is what wizards do, this is what clerics do, and oh look, there's overlap because they have some magic effects that are the same. But that common list also helps gameplay at the table tremendously, because it means that after a while, everybody knows what Fireball does. After a while, everybody knows what Charm Person does. And it isn't suddenly, oh my God, I don't even know what that power is that you just used. I'll take your, I'm often this way as a DM. I'll take your word for it on what it does.
And I think that's about getting back to the iconic identity of what D&D is and what Magic and D&D does. And making sure that it feels like, oh yeah, this is D&D. This is resonant. I know what this is. I'm not constantly trying to figure out what you're, I kind of like to use the joke of like if you're playing like a Shardmine Dampier, hybrid Rune Priest Seeker, like what is that, right? Like you couldn't even, a lot of people would have no idea. So.
Thank you.
It is in some states.
Yes.
In some states.
You stated that D&D Next is going to be an amalgamation of all previous editions. How is that going to be reflected in the pantheon of deities for the core game?
Oh, for the DDs? So one of the things I'd really like to be able to do, and this is still kind of a question mark, is just make sure that the you can imagine, for example, taking, say, the top 3 or 4 settings and taking the top 4 or 5 gods and making sure that those are available. Because we know people are playing different campaign settings and making sure that, hey, we can give you the kind of like God of War, some like, or a God of, whatever, exploring dungeons and killing kobolds, but, give you some generic ones, but then make sure, because one of the nice things, again, when we go back to our simpler system, is it doesn't take a ton of work for us to make a new domain. We can focus instead on, hey, what's St. Cuthbert like? What's his story? Okay, he hates Ayus. So, hey, if you're playing St. Cuthbert, we know you're playing in Greyhawks, we can give you a special ability against cultists of Ayus, right? And it's cool, right? Because that's would make sense, right? Or something like that. So we can be a lot more specific, because it's not going to take as much work to get that done. Question here?
I was just wondering how locked into the medieval fantasy is Next going to be? Because perhaps we like Gamma World or something in my group, and I want to use Next's edition rules for, say, Gamma World. Is that possible? Would it be done?
So one of the things, this is kind of like a secret design goal. Like, we don't really like, oh, hey, this is, when people, like, the people who are paying us say, so what are you working on this month? We don't tell them, hey, this is what we're doing. Like, we're working on D&D. But one of the things,
but now it's being caught on tape.
Yeah, exactly, right? Right back there, right? Turn off no more mics, right? No.
Secrets out.
But for me personally as a designer, I think we're on the right track when I look at the system, especially the core system. And I think, if I just took these character classes out and I put in a system for building a superhero, or if I gave you like, hey, like kind of like the Omega World version of D20 that came out, or even the version we just did. So, hey, I have a mutant and I can add mutant powers. Am I being too loud again? Sorry. Apparently, I'm now having microphone malfunctions here. You just tell me, just shove it back. I'll just do it. Just yell it. Just throw something at me. And actually, this is the last question I can answer because I got to head over to to practice for the keynote. But so this is kind of like one of the secret agendas for me, because I think this is a sign of a good RPG system, is when you look at it, you realize, hey, just like you can add these different modules for fantasy, you can go the other way and go, hey, well, this is how I think a superhero system would work. This is how you could add mutations and ray guns and robots and death rays. And this, like, and my secret thing is I always think, how would I run Star Frontiers with this, right? That's always, because that's the second RPG I ever played. So I'm always like, okay, how would Dralacites work and things like that.
Yeah, because we want you to be kit bashing with it.
And that's definitely, I think, something which, I think a great RPG system, especially if you're a tinkerer, you look at it and you think like, oh, here's how I want to mess with the system to do something different.
But to get back also to the start of your question, the core assumptions of the game are definitely fantasy.
Yeah.
And specifically the amalgamation that is at the heart of D&D of sword and sorcery elements and high fantasy elements. Because D&D is this, as many of you know, is this kind of bizarre hybrid between two versions of fantasy that aren't actually always that compatible, but that's part of the magic of Dungeons and Dragons.